All right, that just about does it. Hey guys, Daniel here. Welcome back to the Jet Fuel Only channel. I'm on the passenger side of my Cadillac CTS and I just replaced the rearward lower control arm. Now, you've seen my other video where I did the forward lower control arms. These are different parts. The install is very similar with a few differences. So in this video, we're gonna do the driver's side over there, and I'm gonna tell you how to recognize when it's time to replace this, all the torque specs, and of course the detailed how-to that you're accustomed to on the Jet Fuel Only channel. Let's get started. All right, guys, that's right. We are replacing control arms again, but these are the rearward lower control arms. Last video was the forward lower control arms. Why are they called that? Well, they're more forward on the car. These are more rearward. Also, the forward lower control arms, the ball joint comes in through the top. These come in through the bottom. This procedure is going to be very similar in 6th gen Camaros, ATSs, and pretty much the same on all the CTSs. The all-wheel drive, of course, a little different, and the cts-v also has a different part number, but pretty much the same procedure with minor differences. Now, how do you know when you need to replace your lower control arms? Well, these, I started to notice that the ball joint was squeezing out grease from this boot. Now, on some cars, you can just get a whole new boot and put grease in, but not for the CTS. So no big deal, that doesn't mean it's going bad yet, but once that grease disappears, this smooth action is not gonna be so smooth and there's gonna be metal contact, which means there could be play in there. If there's play, your steering and suspension are gonna be mushy or you're gonna get noises. You don't want that. Another part is here where a bolt attaches this to the car. And these are rubber here. These bushings can wear out or dry out and crack, and once those get loose, then again, you're gonna have squishy suspension, maybe noises, and it's definitely gonna mess with your alignment. When your alignment's messed up, it's gonna mess with your tire wear. These actually look really good here on the bushings, and here they're still good, but I wanted to get ahead of it. Now, originally only the driver's side looked like this, but by the time I finally got started on that passenger side, yep, grease is coming out of that one too, so it was time to do it. So where do you get these parts? Well, you can get them from your favorite parts dealer. I work with 404parts.com. They have a whole kit of all 4 control arms, plus the necessary bolts that you have to replace. It's about $420 plus shipping, but you can also request to just get the arms you need, but I always recommend getting both sides. Don't just replace one side, it's not the right way to do things. Today I'm also going to be replacing the sway bar end links or drop links. You can check out my other video for that replacement. It's super easy. All right, let's get started with the driver side rearward lower control arm. For this installation, you'll need the following tools. You'll want a large ratchet or driver, 6mm hex socket or key, T15 Torx bit or driver, 10mm socket, 2 18mm sockets and or wrenches, a 21mm socket or wrench, a torque wrench capable of 30 to 74 foot-pounds, plastic trim pry tools, a ball joint separator is recommended, and a jack and jack stands. If you need help removing the wheels or jacking up the car, I have videos on those as well. Check the description for links. And here's a quick 30-second overview for you pros. We're gonna remove this splash shield, and then we have access to our control arm where we'll remove this 18mm nut and bolt combo, separate the magnetic ride control link, remove this 21mm nut at the ball joint, separate it, swap out the link, reinstall, and properly torque down all the nuts and bolts. Check the description for torque numbers, and that's just the overview, but stick around for details and important techniques. With the wheels off, it's gonna be a lot easier to access the 3 fasteners in the wheel well area that we need to remove on the edge of the underbody splash shield that is helpful to remove to access the bolts to remove the control arms. So these will be T15 Torx screws as well as 1 push-in plastic retainer. The splash shield has 8 10mm bolts marked in red and at least 1, maybe 2 plastic retainer clips in green. so now we can see the steering rack, and over here easily see the control arm bolts on each side. Here you can clearly see the front rear lower control arm. One end of the control arm is attached to the spindle with a ball joint and a 21mm nut. So the bolt that goes through here is an 18mm, and the nut on the other side is also an 18mm. You'll want to hold the nut on one side, or the bolt, it doesn't matter, and then unscrew from the other end. Now generally you'd use a ratchet and hold the wrench there, but I'm going to use an impact wrench. It makes things a lot easier. So there's not a lot of room here with the steering in the way, so I'm using a wobble extension on my impact to make it fit. That makes it super easy. Now I'm not going to remove it completely. I'll wait until I get the ball joint off, but there's one more thing we need to remove. This right here. On cars with mag ride suspension, this here moves this little electronic potentiometer. So when this control arm goes up and down, it gives this thing the certain signal that it needs to send to the struts to give you better handling. So you won't have that on some cars, only cars with mag ride, so we need to pull this off. It's just on there with a ball socket. Use my pry tool to get that out. Go. We also need to remove this because the new one doesn't come with one of these. So that comes off with a 10mm. I'll use this deep socket and an impact. And it's off. All right, so behind our brake, we can see where our lower control arm attaches to the spindle, right here. Now this is a 21mm nut. It can come off, but sometimes when you start removing it, the center bolt that it's attached to starts spinning as well. So optimally, you would have a hex key socket bit that you could put in here with a ratchet while you turn the nut with a wrench at the same time, and that makes it easier. You can ratchet back and forth. Unfortunately, I don't have a hex key socket anymore. I have a 5 and a 7. I don't know where my 6 is, so we got to do it the hard way, and that is this wrench is a 21mm, and then I'll put my hex key in the top and hold that in place while we crank off the bolt or the nut. And then we got to go back and forth as we loosen it. Certainly pretty tedious. Now if you have your impact, you could probably just zip it right off. But not in this case. Sometimes that's the case, but not in this case. So we just get to do it the hard way. That is off. Now separating the ball joint from the spindle can be difficult, especially if you live in like the Rust Belt or something. This can be compressed together pretty tight. Now the other side came out pretty easy, but if it's not easy, you're gonna want a tool like this. This is a ball joint separator. This one's from Harbor Freight. Unfortunately, this width is not big enough. Slide in here and get on top of the nut when this is fully seated. So this one's not going to work for me if it was stuck. The other thing people do is they've got a ball joint separator or pickle fork like this. This one happens to be too narrow, so you want to have one that's wide enough to get in here and pry this down away from the spindle. Your other choice is to give it a good whack right about here with a hammer, and that will actually help separate that sort of bond that these two have, and then you can pry it away. I can already tell this one is separating automatically, so I don't need any force whatsoever. Let's just take it off. There we go. But notice over here, we still got this bolt attached, so let's remove that. I am gonna tell you, because of the steering position, this bolt needs to go out this way, and it's gonna hit the steering rack, so I need to reposition the wheel so this straightens out and it's a little more out of the way. All right, we got the old one out. It's totally separated from the boot, pretty wiggly and wobbly there. This is the one that failed first, so this one has been failed the longest. All right, so now we need to reattach the mag ride suspension ball here back into this spot. And if you look closely, that is actually not a threaded hole, but this is threaded. How does that work? Well, this is aluminum and this is steel. It's gonna cut the threads for you. So just get it started real carefully, as even as you can. and then use a wrench or your driver to put it in all the way. All right, there we go. Now to install the lower control arms, it's just the reverse process, but the important part, folks, is the torque specs. So let's get it on, I'll show you how to torque it. Reposition this right back up in there. Use our new bolt, because these get a lot of torque. You want to replace it with a new one. Nut. And now I'll get it mostly cranked down with the impact, but we'll do our final torque by hand. Now it's not too tight, so this moves pretty easy, and we can reattach this mag ride suspension link. It snaps onto that ball part. You might be able to do it by hand, there, like that, and if not, just give it a light tap with the small hammer. I'm gonna clean up the old grease on the spindle. All right, that works, and we'll just tuck that back into that hole. And push it all the way up in there. Get your nut. And screw it on down. Now I can only get it so far with my hand, and then even if I use a wrench after this, it's just gonna turn the actual ball joint bolt, so we'll do it the slow way. All right, now for the all-important torquing procedure. You want to get your torque wrench and set it to 30 foot-pounds. That's pretty low on this big torque wrench, so maybe even a middle torque wrench would be even better, but we're going to do 30 foot-pounds on this nut. After you've reached that point, we're going to continue turning another 120 to 135 degrees. Now you can pretty much just guesstimate that, but I'll try to show you here best I can. Now that was much looser than expected. I actually had to back off the nut and then re-find the click for 30 foot-pounds, because even tightening with my regular wrench was more than 30 foot-pounds. But where it gets tight, folks, is that 120 to 135 extra degrees of turn. So let's get that done. Now we don't need the torque wrench anymore, so I'm just gonna use this wrench for the angle. And then I do have to hold the inner bolt in place if it starts to turn, which I can already tell it is. So, note the position of the wrench now. We need to turn it at least 90 degrees and then another about 30 degrees beyond that. So I'll turn it as far as I can, which should be about 90 degrees. Okay, I would say that was almost 90 degrees. I'll get started on it again to get another, say, 30 or 40 degrees out of it, hopefully. And you know what? It just feels pretty darn firm, and just feels like the right spot. If you know it, if you're experienced enough, you'll recognize that. All right, now that we torqued that, let's do that last rear bolt, and then we're done. This bolt needs to be torqued to 74 foot-pounds plus 90 to 105 degrees. So I've got my torque wrench set to 74 foot-pounds, and it's not tight enough yet, so I gotta hold this other nut. Okay, here should be our pass for 74. There it is. So now I need to go 90 degrees. All right, that'll do it. All right, folks, that's it for changing out the rearward lower control arms on the CTS, and the procedure is pretty much the same for the ATS and Camaro. Again, if you need those part numbers or those torque specs, they're all in the description below. And if you see any ways to improve this installation, be sure to comment below as well. Now I've got another video I'm going to film right now, and that is replacing the end links for the sway bars up front. So you'll want to check that out. It can get rid of some minor clunks you might feel in the front suspension. Now if you haven't already, be sure to like, subscribe, hit the bell to be notified of future Cadillac content. Thank you so much for watching the Jet Fuel Only channel. We'll see you next time.